Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is July 6th, 2020, episode 62, and the last episode before we take a 2-week hiatus.
I know we're taking a break. I don't know what our legion of fans will do for 2 weeks.
The many that who can only live their lives because of the sweet nectar that is our podcast being poured into their mouths.
Either that or they'll just, totally forget us and we'll come back and we'll be like,
they'll realize,
why isn't anybody here?
Yeah, they'll just realize, what? I have better things to do with my time.
Realize how much better their life is without us.
Yeah. I mean, I do think maybe we add to anxiety with our sharp, incisive analysis.
It's true. But I just have to point out that today for our topic, I'm wearing my I Preach Like Black Lives Matter shirt.
You've had that for a while, like before it was cool.
I've had that for a long time. My friend and colleague, Brandy Mitzram, made this. So not only can she make cool shirts, but she's an AME pastor and a brilliant theologian as well. So that's a really impressive combination.
A lot of people don't realize that theologians have other skills.
I know.
In this case, making
a lot of theologians
t-shirts.
Yeah, a lot of theologians have to have other skills, otherwise you starve to death.
The number of friends of mine that have PhDs in theology or related fields that have worked retail or deliver pizzas is high.
Yeah.
I have a lot of
the unemployed PhD. It's been a thing for a long time.
The only thing more common is people with MDivs who, like in terms of theology degrees, MDivs who do not pastor. There's just a lot of us.
Yeah,
bouncing around in the world.
It is. All right. So true Christianity.
Yeah.
So I suggested this the other day because I saw a post that Mark made about this, which we'll have him explain here in a moment. And I had gotten into a similar mess trying to talk to somebody else about this. And I just thought, as a way to kind of send us off before this break, this would be a fun thing to talk about. So, also we should mention, just because we're keeping track of Antifa's location all over the country.
Yeah, their invasion.
That they were supposed to show up in Gettysburg to burn flags.
Yeah, someone created this bogus profile, which, of course, any liberal will tell you it must be a Russian.
Yes.
Created this bogus Facebook page or whatever event saying we're going to burn the flag. Fuck America, July 4th, Gettysburg.
Right. And so all these white militiamen showed up in Gettysburg to defend the flag. And of course, the whole thing was a joke.
The funny thing is how many of these dudes on motorcycles had Confederate flags on their bikes. And they're like, we got to defend the American flag. You can't really do both those flags at the same time. I'm not a flag person. I'm not patriotic even a little. But I know you don't put those two flags together because that just is dumb. But whatever.
No. Anyway, so watch out. Antifa is coming to a town near you. Maybe.
This is like a thing. You were telling me about Aurora protests, crackdowns being done in the name of quelling Antifa.
Yes. So if you're following what's going on in Aurora, where Elijah McClain was murdered about 10 months ago by the cops, and there are now all these great protests and activities going on. And my son Max and his partner Sarah have been there. And yeah, this is the line that the city is using for why it's okay to pepper spray 9-year-olds with violins, is because they're actually Antifa coming to burn the police station down. So they've been using this as an excuse for their behavior and also as a reason to dismiss the protesters. No, it's really fascinating how this is just growing. But anyway, we should move on because we could get stuck in Antifa land for a long time.
It makes sense that if there's protesters with instruments, you need to go after them because Antifa is prone to violence
Yes. Oof, bad. Okay.
Moving on for the sake of us all.
Yes. All right. So explain your post here.
I just noticed there's a lot of nuance to this, but the basic thing is this: if here I am, disgusted with Donald Trump or any person who calls themselves Christian, or evangelicals, let's say fundamentalist evangelicals, and I don't like their politics, their spirituality, I think it's all bogus, it's false, it's toxic. It's easy for me to say, they're not Christians, they're not the true Christians, that's false Christianity. And now the implication when you make that statement is that somehow you are on the side of what is true Christianity. And to me, when we make that move, it's problematic for a number of reasons. Number one, it's like me calling other white people white, but not owning it for myself. The thing is, Christianity in our society is more like whiteness than we would care to think, because it shapes everybody everybody is shaped by Christianity in America. It hits everybody differently. And if you're white and you understand how Christianity functions even little, you have a certain kind of Christian privilege. And so I feel like when you just dump that all on Trump and his ilk, then you're not owning your own complicity. The other piece of it is I tend to define Christianity more sociologically, meaning, look, if for 2,000 years, people who call themselves Christians have oppressed the shit out of other folks, it's just too easy to say, oh, that's not real Christianity. And this detached, utopian, platonic ideal floating out there of Christianity is somehow real, even though it's never been the dominant expression. To me, all this is just a ways of disengaging from any responsibility. So that's the basic idea. Now I have sympathies for, like, if you're experiencing religious abuse in Christian settings and you need for your own healing to distance yourself from that label, fine. I'm not like I want to police this. It's just this overall maneuver of like, I'm the true Christian, they're the false Christian. It doesn't help. That's the basic idea. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I want to.
And so,
because John said prone to violence. Nice. Some people appreciated that, Dan.
Yeah. I appreciated it. I chose to ignore it, but I appreciated it. we can also, yeah. So here's my take on this. And again, I got into a lot of trouble. This one of those unemployed PhD types got really mad at me once. We were trying to discuss this. I just had to delete all my posts because the guy was being such a dick. But so to me, there's actually, I would say that there's kind of two ways that this word can be used or can be looked at. So one is, as you say, sociologically, or I would use the term descriptively. So if you're just going to say, like, who in history and in the current world is a Christian, I feel like if you're going to use it that way, you simply have to include every group that has self-described themselves as Christian. Like, you can't just suddenly start eliminating people because there's no basis on that, right? So, so if Westboro Baptist Church says they're Christian, you just have to say, all right, well, that is an expression of Christianity, right? Like, they're a Christian.
Doesn't mean you have to think they're okay, or even if
no,
like, if
no,
you
there's
believe
no judgment. There's no moral assessment at all. This is just like, it's like cataloging.
You could even think they're going to hell and that they have no real relationship with Jesus, but that's not what most people mean when they say the word Christian.
Yeah. So again, it's more like cataloging. It's like saying, okay, I'm going to catalog all the types of beetles in the world, and you get them and you put them on a little pin and you stick them somewhere. And, you're not saying like, well, I like this beetle more than another beetle, or this is a better beetle than that beetle. You're just like, we're just cataloging it. Like, these are all the expressions of Christianity. Now, then on the other hand, though, it does seem like when we're using this term, we can also talk about it kind of aspirationally. Like,
that's true.
Right? Like, we can say, okay, so a term that means potentially anything is kind of a useless term, right?
That's right.
I mean, so and one thing that's really fun to do is to look up atheist cartoons. I mean, a lot of them are kind of dumb, but some of them are really good and funny. And I remember this one once where it was these newscasters, like there were 3 newscasters in the cartoon, and they all were saying, well, I spoke to God. They were all, they weren't newscasters. It was a newscast, but they were all pastors. Mm-hmm. Well, I spoke to God today, and God told me, and then they all had completely opposite things of what God thought, right? So one guy spoke to God and God liked gay people. One guy spoke to God and God was sending gay people to hell. One guy spoke to God and something else different was happening, right? And obviously the point of the cartoon is that if God is real and exists, then the idea that God has all these completely opposite views is ridiculous. And of course, the atheist wants to say, well, this just proves that God doesn't exist, or that all these Christians are frauds or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I do think that it's important to also use this term from this aspirational point of view and say, okay, well, what would a true or authentic Christianity actually look like? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, and this is tricky because part of it is like, I mean, a lot of this gets into semantics. Because to me,
I think it's all about semantics. Yeah. We're talking about words.
Well, but there's a lot of it is people will use the same words in very different ways, I guess is what I'm saying. And so true and false, like for me, that sort of category, I don't think it's helpful. But if someone said, well, healthy and toxic, I'm like, oh, I could get on board with that. What does healthy Christianity look like and what is toxic? But once you get to true or false, it's just kind of like it's like a binary. Whereas healthy and toxic, there's almost this assumption more of a spectrum. I'm like, okay, well, that's at least more helpful for me. Or if we're saying, well, historically, or dominant expressions of Christianity versus righteous expressions or beautiful expressions.
Right.
I mean,
yeah,
that's a little different. And to me, then it gets away from this sort of like getting myself off the hook, because you were saying, well, we've all been stained by, in Western society, all of us have been touched by toxic Christianity, right. But there's still an aspirational Christianity worth fighting for. And that I don't assume that I have that entirely. Like that's kind of what I would want people to have more of a posture about.
Well, yeah, and the sort of modernist idea that I can extract myself from my formation, my history, my background, everything that's happened to me, and I gaze out on the landscape of things, and I have the correct objective idea. That's highly problematic, right? So any description of Christianity that we want to say is somehow good, we have to be looking at ourselves and saying, okay, so what of that are we not?
Yes, and this gets into another plug for your systems class, which, when is that?
Right. Starts July 20th.
So that's coming pretty quick. So right when we come back to the show, it'll be, so this might be the last chance you hear from us to sign for that. But this is the other piece. I feel, and again, I'm not assuming everyone does this, but when someone says, that's not real Christianity is this, what they're describing, this thisness, is usually not a very systemic definition. Like when someone makes that move, they're usually saying at some level, the systemic Christianity is false. The true Christianity is this disembodied ideal. And once you do that, all of a sudden, what you're boiling down Christianity to a set of precepts and commitments rather than a set of practices. Because once you start talking about how Christianity is practiced and expressed in the world, you cannot talk about it in an uncompromised way at all. No. Any expression of Christianity or any shared expression of spirituality is flawed at some level. Like this is what I'm going to say that. And so when we do this, like real Christianity is this thing that you can point to that doesn't exist expressed in the real world, then I feel like we've fallen into a set of bad Western habits. Mm-hmm. of thinking about reality,
Yeah.
which, and there's a lot at stake with that in my mind, even though that might sound esoteric to people listening. If we're going to start dividing the world between ideas and that somehow just having ideas about things is sufficient for deep spirituality, then we're kind of screwed.
And of course we can see why this business of, once we get down to habits and practices and how we live, we always enter this very messy, problematic world, because that's how it started, right? I mean, I hope everybody realizes that Jesus wasn't a Christian, that his original followers weren't a Christian. That there was no such word then, that didn't exist.
And even like to call him, like people say, well, he was a good Jew. I'm like, there wasn't even one Judaism back then. This is the same thing.
Right. In fact, Judaism as a thing didn't even exist then. Right?
No. There's all these different takes and approaches within the larger traditions, and most of those traditions probably wouldn't have thought of Jesus as a good one.
Yeah. So the term Christian, arose. We have this biblical reference that arose in Antioch about 7 to 10 years after Jesus had died. And so even at that point, what you have around the Mediterranean basin are all these communities trying to figure out and live and embody and practice, what the hell does this thing mean? Right? And nobody knows. I mean, there's not one right answer, right?
Almost all of Paul's writings are about the difficulty in answering that question.
Of figuring that out. Yeah. And so that's been the sense from day one, right? And there is, in most, almost every Christian tradition, there is this impulse, and they do it in different ways, to try to go back and find this true Christianity, right? And so they're trying to find something that doesn't really exist. And again, though, we can begin to talk about what are habit practices that we are interested in or understand from our sense and life of the tradition, where we are attempting to embody an understanding of a set of teachings. That's the best that we can do.
Yeah.
All right, the comments are now pouring in.
Yeah. Before I dive, one last little thing before I dive into the comments. Part of the other reason it irks me when people do this false real Christian, or I don't need Christianity as a label, it's toxic, I'm a Jesus follower, or any of that sort of all those tactics are things evangelicals do. Right. So when people who are anti-evangelical start doing true, not true Christian, or I'm a Jesus follower, not a Christian, or I don't like labels, all that stuff evangelicals do, and evangelicals are one of the worst at this.
Right.
So we should probably try different linguistic tactics than evangelicals use. So diving back, Scott earlier on said, I want to get my MDiv, but can't ever see myself pastoring again in the traditional church staff setting. That gets at this issue. It's like, okay, part of the complexity is when you start embodying Christianity or anything, you bump up against pre-established systems, and you can never create a system that's separate from everything else. Even like the Amish, people will point to the Amish as not tainted by modern world. People don't realize that a lot of Amish people lost millions of dollars because they had their own version of a Bernie Madoff, because a lot of Amish invest in the stock market, right? And they get the products from the rest of the world. So we're all entangled with each other.
Yep.
So what does it mean? So Scott's question is like, what does it mean for me to pursue this, recognizing I don't know if it fits within an established church? That's part of this tension. Susan writes, okay. Susan and I have been going back and forth a little bit, I think in a good-natured way, I hope, but okay, it's real Christianity that sucks. That's fair. I could say it's all real.
Right.
Some of it's
well, and again, I do think that that's where this descriptive thing versus the aspirational thing is kind of another helpful way to understand this, right? Is that, and again, like going back to the Beatle example. So I could catalog all these Beatles, and I could say, well, some of these beetles, when they bite you, they kill you. And, I don't really like that kind of beetle. Some of these beetles I never see, they're really benign, right?
Kind of like
but, yeah, but they're all beetles, and, that's okay.
Yep.
All right, Julia says hi. Hi back, Julia. Good
Top
to
of the
see
morning
you again.
too. Susan writes, good point. I like the healthy toxic versus true false, not real, not real.
Yeah. And again, this gets at the discernment tradition, right? Because so the discernment tradition in Christianity is really getting at this issue. And look, this other thing we're talking about also has biblical roots, right? I mean, Jesus says there are some people who are going to say, I'm your follower, and they're actually not my follower, right? So this idea of discerning of spirits and what is the spirit behind something also is a very legitimate tradition, right? And so we can say, oh, all these people say they're Christian, but now we have to test the spirits. We do have to discern what is going on and where is it that God seems to be present, what seems to be life-giving, and what seems to not be life-giving. So again, it's not true or false in this, as you said, this sort of abstracted Platonic ideal way. It has to do with more when we actually look at what is happening on the ground and in people's lives and in the life of the community. Do we see any signs that the Spirit of God is working there or not? And that's an important thing to do.
It's also like this metaphor of fruit trees that Jesus and others in the scriptural traditions talk about. So Jesus never says, you're not a tree. He says, oh, that tree doesn't bear good fruit.
Right.
It's got toxic fruit. Yeah. Gus writes, super convenient. We always have the true Christianity.
Yes, it is very convenient.
That's the thing. Like, I don't want to claim that. I believe I have a vital and real relationship with the Spirit of God. Okay. I believe that to be true, but I would never say that I understand the true Christianity. That's part of it too. And part of it's because of my temperament is anarchic and apophatic, which, to unpack those terms, like I find that building up hierarchical structures where I'm somehow think that I'm higher than other people, I avoid that. And then I also think that God has found, what we say about God almost always creates an idol about God. So if I try to somehow say, this is it, this is what God is, then already I know that I'm not getting it right. My instinct is always like, no, what I can do is discern what's life-giving and what's death-dealing and move towards Jesus into deeper intimacy and greater righteousness and compassion. I believe those things. But once I get definitional, it locks it in, and I tend to avoid that sort of posture. Let's see. Susan writes, but oh man, you're giving me a flashback. Wayne Grudem's systematic theology. Oh my. I want to know what thing we said. Did something we say remind you of Wayne Grudem? Like what he would say? Or were we saying something that, like, I want to know more about that because I don't.
We don't know. We're not Wayne Gruder fans.
Well, I used to be.
Oh, really? You know who that is?
Yeah, he, so at Northwestern College, the fundamentalist school that I attended, most evangelical schools at the time would use one of two systematic theology texts, Wayne Grudem's text or Millard Erickson's text, and both are piles of monkey poo. But Wayne Grudem, to give you a sense, like he pretty much believes almost exactly the same way John Piper thinks about things.
Okay.
So.
Okay, well, luckily I have not dove into those piles.
I'm glad.
So
you're better off.
Better off. All right.
Ceres writes, the need of saying who is the true Christian just reinforces radical individualism and cult dynamics. We use this line of thinking on other spiritualities and ideologies to pick ones that serve your own BS. I see white martial artists use the true false thinking purity to justify their own racism and superiority to non-white cultures that created the martial arts, for example. Yeah. I think this is true. Like I see this a lot. I was looking for a local school for my son to do various martial arts. We didn't do it because of the pandemic, but I noticed this tendency of purity testing by white teachers. It's huge and rampant, which doesn't seem to be the way that I saw more traditional practitioners talking about things.
Yeah, and this series you bringing up this cult dynamics issue. I mean, that's the in-out purity thing is of course huge in cult dynamics. But I want to keep rolling through this because of course we're blazing through our time. We've got a lot of good comments here.
Scott writes, I remember being called not a full Christian because I couldn't understand the Bible. This was from a person who converted/saved me when I asked them why the Bible was confusing. I've also had issues around that.
Yeah.
Because I questioned the Bible.
Right.
Which I still question the Bible. Carol writes, we meet people where we find them. And that means we have to try to understand them, to look past the ugly stuff they spew more deeply. It feels like you are asking me to try to do what Jesus taught. God. To me, this is partly about empathy, but like, I don't think empathy and judgment are cross purposes. Like I actually have empathy towards Donald Trump, but I judge his actions and his beliefs harshly.
Yeah, and again, this is, judgment is another one of these terms that has the usage of it has gotten flattened out, right, to mean this sort of negative moral punishment thing. But one way to use the term judgment is very similar to discernment. Like we assess things, right? It's the synonym of assessment. Like we judge what are things like, and we can have a lot of empathy and compassion for people, but we also need to judge and assess what they're up to, and that's a very important thing.
My tendency is to judge ideas and actions, like we wrestle against principalities and powers, not against flesh and blood. So I believe deep down inside there's a person whose desires at the core might be good that have become twisted. I think that's important. Julie writes, I was partially raised by Catholic nuns who were Christ to me. I got lucky. They practiced showing love. That's great.
No, that's nice. Not all nuns did that, but that's good that your nuns did.
Most nuns I've met have been very nice. Most brothers I've met have not been as nice. Susan writes, it's just so exhausting. It is. I'm tired just talking about this, if I'm honest, because it really gets into the complexity and murk and nastiness and difficulty. Like we'd love things to be clean and right.
No. Well, although let me say something about that. So if a practice and activity is over-exhausting, then sometimes that's a sign in our discernment that the way we're doing something or the practice of it is not of God, right? It's not life-giving. So one of the things is that, sometimes if what we find is that worrying about what somebody else is doing is exhausting and not life-giving, one approach is to do that less, and again, to focus on our own spiritual life and growth more. And sometimes that can be more life-giving. That's just a thought. All right, next.
Chris, is it not a measure of how we imitate Jesus? That would embody unconditional love, humility, service, and being non-judgmental. Whereas in Micah, what is required of us but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. There's a way we could make the case that, true religion is this, that we care for widows and orphans. Like, I think there's something, it's important to name what we think of as healthy, life-giving religion and spirituality and aim for that. Yeah. But also to recognize that you can say that's more Christian, but we have to, we can't just surgically cut off everything that isn't that and put it on the other side of a wall, because it just doesn't, we're all too enmeshed. Especially because what you're writing here, unconditional love, humility, service, being non-judgmental, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. John Piper would agree with all those things.
Right.
Those are all empty signifiers if they remain abstract. It's when you start getting particular that you get into problems. Like, what does it mean to love unconditionally? Does it mean accepting trans people, or lovingly challenging that they're corrupted and that they need healing?
Yeah. Right. And see, that's always the issue, because all of these terms sound great, And that's again the point, is that every expression of Christianity at some level actually agrees with all of those statements. And so that's where it becomes this issue of how is our life lived in particular in our place, and how do we apply those terms. And so again, when we're standing outside from an abstracted point of view and say, well, I do all those things, well, then you have to start kind of poking at that a little bit and looking at all the particulars of how these engage.
I just noticed up on the top here, we got our first angry emoji for one of our episodes. So we made somebody angry.
Oh, good.
We earned something. Just to get through these quickly, since we're past time, Catherine.
Well, maybe we could go a little longer, since we're not going to do anything for 2 weeks.
Yeah, especially because I always think Adam's lurking out there and wondering if he's going to drop in the last moment, like a ninja. Catherine writes, the problem of how to be an ethical person believing and practicing a religion with such a history of systemic violence really tormented me in my 20s. I understand that. Evangelicalism strongly discouraged systemic reflection. I think because doing the needed reflection meant making a fundamental shift in theology, which would then paradoxically mean that to many evangelicals, I was not a true Christian.
Right.
You just said a lot, and I totally resonate with this. There is, for evangelicalism, at least the way I received it, if you didn't do things a particular way, have a particular way of seeing things, it was all or nothing. So what happened when a lot of people were in that spot that you described and that I've experienced, they just walked away from it all. So I have a number of friends who consider themselves fundamentally not Christian. This is the irony of this sort of language, by the way. They don't think of themselves as Christians at all anymore. I, however, decided, came through that thinking, no, I'm going to own Christianity even more in a way. And I would actually see these friends of mine who don't consider themselves Christians at all as much more like Jesus than most Christians. And so it just shows, what does it mean to say I'm a Christian?
Right.
If it's an identifier, if it's something that you choose, like a self-descriptor that you pick up, like some sort of spiritual identity, then it's problematic, because then it's just all about your choice. And then we don't have a way of talking about how much Christianity shapes you.
Yeah. And in many ways, all of this touches on kind of a much wider question about identity formation in general, right? So what does that mean, right? What is an identity, right? When we just got through the 4th of July weekend. When I say I'm an American, what does that mean? When I say, I'm a Christian, I'm a human, what do all these things mean? These are identity signifiers that come with a whole boatload of mythologies, narratives, formational experiences that are different, right, all across the spectrum of this. And, from a contemplative point of view, what Christianity and any spiritual tradition is about is actually undoing identity, right? So, the Buddhists have this great statement: if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. And, part of what that's getting at, right, is this kind of anti-idolatrous identity formation piece. And so, in some ways, is any solidification of the word Christianity going to be a problem? And I would suggest that it is.
Well, and this is the thing, so your American example makes a lot of sense, because when I say I'm an American, and let's say my cousin Bubba, to use a bad trope, says he's American, we both mean that we are citizens, but when I say it, it's a confessional thing I'm trying to undo. When he says it, it's out of a place of pride. And so same with being a Christian. When I say I'm a Christian, as much as I love Jesus and I'm about that, I usually mean it as a sort of confession of this is my burden, because it shaped me. And I find myself drawn to Jesus, who's theoretically at the heart of Christianity, but recognize the vast majority of what we call Christianity has not been healthy, in my perspective. So it's
okay. Ellen is going wild here.
Ellen going wild.
Yes.
Ellen writes, but if we're the body of Christ, can we poop out the shit? The shit is technically in the body. My answer is the parable of the wheat and tares. We don't weed the field. Let them grow together. So many rich
and then later,
filmy metaphors.
And then later she's got a comment.
Only an ass can get rid of the poop. Not without the help of the duodenum and the entire digestive system.
Okay, well.
The responsibility falls on the butthole. You're right, Ellen.
I have to say, I have very little idea of what you're talking about there, Ellen, but it sounds awesome.
The body of Christ metaphors are rich.
Yeah. Okay, Julia.
Writes, when the Atheist Club at St. Olaf College invited me to come speak with them, I experienced them as acting and being more Christian than many Christians. That was a revelation.
Yeah, well, and you know, Julia, a lot of people have had these experiences, made these kinds of comments, right? I mean, Gandhi has this great expression, you know, I like Jesus, I'm just not too fond of Christians. You know, I've had fundamentalists talk to me about going to other countries that were predominantly non-Christian countries, experiencing those people as more Christian than many of the people at their churches. I had a young guy that was hosting me for an event up in Canada that said, yeah, the atheist kids that my kids play with and their families seem a lot more Christian to me than a lot of the kids and families at my fundamentalist church. You know, and I think that this does get at exactly what we're talking about, that, you know, in many ways, when we're talking about a spiritual tradition, the trueness is much more about lived life and practice than any kind of doctrinal assent. And so we can see all these paradoxical sorts of situations when we delve into that. He's here. He's got an image.
Yeah, Adam lurked in after the time was done, as we suspected he might with it. I can't click that and open it, so but people can go there, and I hope it's good. And I'll do that after the broadcast. I'll click that link. John writes, I really appreciate Mark's comment about people withdrawing from institutional religion and considering themselves no longer Christian. I'm glad you appreciate that.
Yeah, and you know, and just sort of back a little bit to your comment about the violence issue, right? And that, you know, I think that there is, and to me, this applies to all of these systems, right? I mean, you know, a lot of times I'm horrified personally by being human, right? When I look at human history, I think, you know, couldn't I be a fern or something like that? That would be a lot more peaceful. And yeah, and all of the systems that we are a part of have this incredible history of violence, oppression, abuse, all kinds of things, because that's what humans do. And so, right, how do we kind of position ourselves in terms of all of these identifiers, and how do we use those identifiers in our lives, right? Are they are the identifiers themselves life-giving or death-dealing? Mm-hmm. And if they're death-dealing over time, yeah, it may be very, very useful to get rid of them.
This is where it gets all tricky. Like, to me, one thing that's helped for me is to, like, once I was able to get rid of the hell heaven stuff, which I feel like I'm an agnostic about, honestly, and I started realizing it's not like I don't have to feel anxiety about making sure people join my team. Right. Once I delinked my Christianity from that, and it became like purely about gift, like how can I be present in a way that honors Jesus as I understand it, or extends Christ consciousness, like however you want to frame that, as a positive presence in the world, without like feeling like this need to save people, this need to have people on my team. That actually made it easier for me to really own my relationship with Jesus as a positive thing and the Spirit of God, and also own Christianity as baggage, and still say, like, I don't think I'm less Christian than I ever have been. But to me, I can hold that with all of its tension without feeling incredibly anxious about it.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's like, okay, I don't care if you're a Christian or not. I really don't. I honestly believe that most people that I've met who aren't Christians are morally better off than most Christians I've met. And that doesn't, it's like, okay, that doesn't, none of that threatens Jesus. My whole relationship with Jesus doesn't depend upon the superiority of my team, which that needs to die. And then it becomes about like, okay, how do I discern the Spirit's movement in the world? Recognizing it's not bound up with this category of Christianity. However, recognizing that I'm shaped by this category of Christianity. And so I tend to think that the way that you deal with toxicity like this systemically is to lean into the problem, not away. It's like why I'm politically active. It's because our system is problematic, and I don't believe in the posture of detachment. I believe in I feel like, no, I need to, just like Jesus, if you see sickness, you touch the sickness to bring healing. Like, so that's why I lean into being a Christian, even though I know it's toxic.
Right. So maybe that was an example of the ass getting rid of the poop.
By me leaning in and touching?
No. letting go.
Yeah,
well, that was part of it. No, letting go of people being on your team. You pooped that out, and then you touched it, and you felt better.
I don't like where this is going, Dan.
Well,
a couple of final comments. We're way past.
We're way past. Thanks for hanging in with us.
Gus writes, there's a couple episodes of the Magnificast, which I recommend. It's basically mostly a Marxist sort of engagement with the Christian tradition, a Catholic Marxist. They did an episode of Is Mike Pence a Real Christian? I'm wondering how that played out, but I encourage people to check out that podcast. Julia writes, yeah, that colonizing activity of trying to save people is experienced as a real form of violence. At least that's how I experienced it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, what is conversion from above? I do believe in like evangelism of a sense of helping share a message of liberation and healing, but it can't be a dominating, like you're in or out. And when it's coming from the oppressors, it's bad news. Adam writes, I had a friend who met the Dalai Lama and was struggling with his faith in a political context. So he asked what he should do. The Dalai Lama told him to be a good Jew. I think owning, and it cuts off. Adam, are you okay? Did someone abduct you before you could finish your statement? Michelle writes, letting go. Great conversation here. Totally real.
Thank you. Thank you. Laura also liked one of the
that is the quote of the day. Probably you're
touching poop and healing it.
Adam writes, I think owning the historical and cultural implications of your identity and beliefs and challenging that is that's right.
Yeah, I mean, one of my Buddhist teachers, Tartang Tulku, talked about that a lot. You know, he didn't want people to become Buddhists. He didn't want Americans to become Buddhists. He would say, you know, just go try to delve into your own history. You know, be a good Jew, be a good Christian, whatever. And actually, the Shalem Institute, Gerald May and the other guy whose name I'm forgetting, they founded that actually shortly after having that conversation with him. So yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in with us. This was great. And remember, the raccoons and the robot birds are coming. So be careful and stay safe out there.
I'm hoping that the robot birds and the raccoons fight each other. It'll bring about the Great War.
I think they're on the same side.
Not if we
maybe teaming up with Antifa.
Not if we can manipulate them into being enemies with one another.
Hack the robot birds.
Yes.
All right. Well, have a great couple weeks, everybody, and we will see you back on the 20th.
Be well.
Be well.